live in Illinois. I'm an LCPC, and I'm in the doctoral education and supervision program.
Okay. Nancy.
Hi, everybody. I am Nancy Hollis. I am in my second year of the Counselor Education and Supervision doctoral program. I'm also a licensed professional counselor in the state of Illinois. I work at a private practice in Chicago.
Sierra.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sierra Swain. I am a second-year doc student in the Counselor Education and Supervision program. I'm an LPC here in Georgia, working in private practice.
Thank you much. I'm not sure if Chandra was able to join us. Chandra?
I'm here.
Oh,
I'm on.
great.
Good morning, everyone. I am Chandra Williams. I am also working in private practice, a licensed counselor in a couple states, and in my second year of my doctoral program.
Excellent. We have Charmaine, who is not able to join us, and then I'm Tiffany Rush Wilson. I'm the associate chair here at the program and had the pleasure of working with all of my co-presenters last term in a class where we decided to work together and create a presentation about creativity in counseling. Let's see if we can move it forward. Okay. So the abstract here, as you all hopefully read, counseling concepts can be challenging to grasp for counseling students and for clients and even for supervisees. So in this presentation, we're going to focus on delivering information in educational and clinical settings that allow you an accessible modality for presenting learning, using metaphors, storytelling, and we'll tell you different examples that we have used in our clinical work with people. So we'll look at clinical constructs such as explaining expected courses of mental health diagnoses and those types of things and how we've used them in our counseling and educational practices. So what we want to do here is to define and operationalize how you can use metaphor in counseling. We will talk about ways in which we've evaluated and critiqued different ways of using metaphor and creativity in counseling, and we'll present you with some of our own examples and allow you some time to create a metaphor within the presentation yourself that perhaps you'll be willing to share with us as a group. And here on the side, I found a metaphor of the house. And sometimes if you're working with a person, you can talk about like the different levels of complexity of a problem or different things that they want to understand in different stages of hierarchy, and how the walls can hold you together and give you structure, and how the roof or the top of a problem can protect you, and just be really symbolic in the way that you speak about moving through different concerns. Sorry. Okay.
Okay, so what is a metaphor? Well, Wikipedia says that a metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action which is not literally applicable. But we use metaphors to help our clients make sense of emotions. And so we'll talk about, there is a part of the brain that does well with metaphors. We'll talk about that in a second. But there's a big link between metaphors, using metaphors and emotions. And it helps to, helps our clients process it. I use a ton of narrative therapy and storytelling in my practice. I also have a private practice. I forgot to say I'm a second year too. So I use a lot of storytelling, and I'll tell a story about, something, and then I'll talk to my client about what was the point of that story, how that story can be used to learn something or to explain something. So metaphors do the same thing, just in a different way.
Metaphors are, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
I was just going to ask if anyone else wanted to contribute. Yeah.
Okay. So metaphors aren't simply linguistic or literary devices. I remember learning about metaphors in 4th grade and similes and using like or as and just seeing it as some part of learning language, learning English, learning how to write. But it's a little bit more than that. We can use metaphors to play an important role in learning for our clients so that we can take something that might be a little bit complex for them and use language and situations and circumstances that are familiar and make the situation they are facing clearer for them. We can recognize working with metaphors with our clients as beneficial for professional counselors because there is a whole lot of research that looks at using metaphor, the frequency of metaphor, the complexity, the variations in metaphor, and how that can help our clients move through very challenging, very difficult situations, and also help our supervisees and help our students figure out things that otherwise might have been really kind of vague and difficult to grasp. Before I move forward, anybody have anything to add? Okay. I do want to plug this a little bit. There is a Journal of Creativity and Mental Health, and we actually have some people in our department who are associated with this and people outside who I've worked with. It's a really amazing journal that will allow you great examples of how research findings have been written up to, excuse me, research findings have been published to let you see how creativity and mental health, metaphor is used in mental health. I'm incredibly tongue-tied right now, so it's kind of funny how I'm using symbolic language and kind of messing it up a little bit. So let me take a breath. This particular journal has several articles in it that allow you to see how mental health can be explained in very creative ways. Similes, metaphors, narratives, storytelling, all types of things have been written up in this journal. One of the things that I was able to use with a client, which is not exactly metaphor, but it's along those lines, and I've done a separate presentation on this, is how we can even use fiction to help people understand complex problems and use it, taking it a step further as metaphor. So for instance, I worked with a woman who was in her 60s at the time and had come from a very closed, small, isolated religious family. And in that family, they didn't talk about things like the way your body changes, about sexuality, about really anything, because those are topics that you just don't discuss. Those things are private. And it's impolite, at least the way this person was raised, it's impolite to discuss these issues and changes in your body. So one of the things that this woman and I did was use fiction to help her understand processes her body had already gone through in the past. And it was because in one of our sessions, she told me that she was willing to share something really private, that she used to have bleeding down there for years and didn't know that she was having a menstrual cycle, excuse me, and that was normal human development. So we used Judy Blume's Are You There, God Is Me, Margaret, read the book, talked about how those things had happened to her, how those things happened to everyone, what the purpose was, but using the fiction allowed it to be externalized from her own experiences in some ways and not feel so dirty or guilty about talking about things she had always been encouraged not to discuss. And this is a person who did not have children. She was in a marriage with someone who had similar types of beliefs. So I was able to use fiction in some ways as metaphor to help this person take away the sting of what had happened throughout her life and what had been very difficult to discuss. Jean, was this one you again?
Yes. So there are a couple interesting things about using metaphor in counseling. So for example, it helps create connections between familiar and new circumstances. So Dr. TRW's example about menstruation and Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret would be an example of this. The other thing is that it can help clarify challenging situations. The use of metaphors helps to describe intense emotions. Nancy told me that she likes to use metaphors with her clients because they're able to separate themselves from the emotion, and then they're able to have the conversation about the emotion based on what the metaphor was that she used. Also, there has been a research article about links to brain functioning. Specifically, they're finding that there's greater activation in the left amygdala associated with emotions. And as you know, the amygdala is where emotions go. So the left side of the amygdala is being activated when using a metaphor.
All right. So what we will do at this point is share with you some of the metaphors that we have used in our work. Before we get to that, though, when I looked up metaphor in counseling, there were tons and tons of metaphors that, resulted from that search. So I kind of created a little mosaic here of multiple metaphors that people can use or have used in counseling articles and different publications. So that is our intro, and then we'll talk about this one. Metaphor in counseling became an issue for me initially because of the mental health sisters. And I've been using this. I wrote that I copywrote it in 2007, but it was actually way before that I started using it. Where I went to school for my doctoral program was the University of Akron. And at that university, there was a counseling psych program. There was counselor education and supervision. Then there was another counseling psych program in the School of Psychology. So one in counselor and education, one in psychology. There was us in counselor ed. There were the master's students in CMHC, and then there were master's students in psychology. And sometimes we all took classes together. And as a doc student, one of my tasks was to do some advising work. And I remember talking to a master's student who actually didn't know what program they were in, because there were so many different programs taking classes together. So this person didn't know, should I be reading the ACA Code of Ethics or the APA Code of Ethics or both? And am I in this program or that? And what am I doing? So to disambiguate this for a student, I made up a little story, and over the years, it's kind of taken off a little bit more. So what I told this person is that medicine and philosophy, let's personify them. And we'll say that they met. I think we had them meet at a specific restaurant, but kind of like a TGI Fridays type restaurant sports bar. They meet each other. That part was inconsequential, and they liked each other. So they decided they were going to start a family. And they had 5 daughters. And the oldest daughter they named Psychiatry. And she's about 17 now. She's really smart, but she's kind of into drugs a little bit. And then there's a sister right underneath her named Psychology, who also is pretty smart, not quite as into drugs, like maybe dabbles here and there in drugs a little bit, but is also pretty smart, but for some reason is a little irritated by the fraternal twins right underneath, social work and counseling. And the reason that Psychology dislikes them is not always clear, but it might have something to do with just she finds them annoying. And they are always seen as kind of like these crunchy granola, wellness focus oriented sisters, and they are always trying to share their quinoa burgers and the wellness just of the world with everybody else. And for some reason that irks Psychology a little bit. And then mom comes home with this new baby, and they name this baby Marriage and Family Therapy. And the other sisters are like, why is she here? Who needs her? Because we can all do that too. So in the house, they really might fight and irritate each other. So Psychiatry might take the car keys and just go to school, and everybody else has to walk. And Psychology takes a shower. Actually, this is the narrative of that. Psychology just takes a shower and uses up all of the hot water, so nobody else can use the hot water. Then counseling and social work want everyone to actually share their quinoa burgers and just sit down and let's talk about this and look at our strengths and how we can all get along better. Nobody's hearing it. And then Marriage and Family Therapy is like, well, why don't we all just sit down and join? Nobody wants to hear that either. So in the house, these sisters might fight. But if you go out on the cul-de-sac where they live, and there's like the geology family or the mathematics family, or I don't know, the chemistry family, if anyone says anything about the mental health sisters, they will all turn on you and fight you to the death because they will stick together when they have to. But then when they are by themselves, they fight a little bit. And part of the issue is sometimes we're looking at making sure there's room for every discipline to have its space and its recognition. And there certainly is room for all of us to have our own space, our own recognition. And I always feel like I have to say that I, in no way, shape, or form want it to seem like any of the mental health sisters is more important than the others. We just all serve a slightly different function in the wellness of an entire community of people. So that is the mental health sisters. And this is really just the narrative, the stuff I just said to you written out. And what I say this to do is to make sure that people understand their own discipline, sorry, its role in the overall mental health picture, mental health family, and how we can sit together at a table to make sure each one of us with the specialties that we have can help support the wellness of the entire population. There's another one that I use with my clients. One of the specialty areas that I do work with is people who have eating disorders. And while many people may not want to compare their body to an auto plant, there are some ways in which the auto plant metaphor works when it comes to eating disorders, particularly with anorexia nervosa. And with that, I won't read it, I'll tell you what happens here. When we look at the economy, when the economy is doing really well and there are lots of, excitement around it, lots of jobs, people will have lots of things they want to do with their money. So if we look at an auto plant, since the economy is doing really well, people have lots of things they want to spend, the auto plant will start to hire. And they'll hire more and more people to make more and more cars because people are driving more places. So the more people drive, the more jobs are available, the more the auto plant hires. We are doing really well, cars everywhere. But if the economy takes a downturn and there's less resource, so people have less money and they're buying fewer cars, then something starts to happen with HR in this auto plant, and they actually have to stop hiring people. Initially, they put a freeze on the hiring, and then eventually they have to start letting people go. And as they let people go and they have fewer people, the systems that do remain in place initially have to work even harder to keep up with any demands that are there. And then eventually, as the resources go away, the plant may have to close. The body works in that same way. So when the body is doing really well, there's a lot of energy in the system. Person's weight might be average or stable. We're doing okay. But then if the body stops having the energy, if there stops being enough food in the body, then things have to start to slow down. And it's another last hired, first fired type situation. So the body is looking, going, there's not enough resource going on. I can't continue to employ all of these systems. Which one is the least important? And that will be the reproductive system, because you don't need it. Your future, your children need it, but you don't actually need it to survive. So your body is saying, this is the amount of energy we devote to this system. Let's get rid of that. So we're trying to conserve and save what the body has so that the body can continue, so the person can live. And after the menstrual period stops, or after the hormone levels are adjusted, the body starts to go to other systems. Usually in the least important is the one that shuts down next. So we might get to the digestive system and go, while we do need you, we don't need you like we need circulatory or central nervous system. So we're going to slow you way, way down, because we've already taken, some of the hormonal power away. This person doesn't have a menstrual period anymore. Their fat cells shrunk down a little bit, because that's where estrogen is housed, in your fat cells. And we even threw fur on the person. When a person starts to lose too much weight, they start to grow something called lanugo, which is essentially fur. So once the reproductive system has exhausted its resources, we'll slow down digestion. And we will continue, and ultimately we'll get to circulatory system, we'll get to even central nervous system. If we get that high up in our layoffs, then the entire system has to stop, because we can no longer support life, and a person can die, with anorexia nervosa having the highest death rate of anything that we diagnose in the DSM. So that is the auto plant metaphor that I use with people. And there's a lot more detail in it. I actually worked with a nurse and a physician to identify the specific systems, if anybody is interested. And then I can certainly always send that to you. But We start with reproductive system, then we look at digestive issues, and then it continues higher up, and ultimately the organism will die, just like the auto plant shut down. And we have some other metaphors that we can talk about here. Oh, before we do that, I'm sorry. There's a short video here I'd like to show, and this is how we can use metaphor in counseling as well.
I once saw a high school teacher lead a simple, powerful exercise to teach his class about privilege and social mobility. He started by giving each student a scrap piece of paper and asked them to crumple it up. Then he moved the recycling bin to the front of the room. He said, "The game is simple. You all represent the country's population, and everyone in the country has a chance to become wealthy and move into the upper class. To move into the upper class, all you must do is throw your wadded up paper into the bin while sitting in your seat." The students in the back of the room immediately piped up saying, "This is unfair." They could see the rows of students in front of them had a much better chance. Everyone took their shots and, as expected, most of the students in the front made it, but not all, and only a few students in the back of the room made it. He concluded by saying, "The closer you were to the recycling bin, the better your odds." This is what privilege looks like. Did you notice how the only ones who complained about fairness were in the back of the room? By contrast, people in the front of the room were less likely to be aware of the privilege they were born into. All they can see is 10 feet between them and their goal. Your job as students who are receiving an education is to be aware of your privilege and use this particular privilege called education to do your best to achieve great things, all while advocating for those in the rows behind you.
That was something that I thought was a nice, clear, succinct way of showing how privilege can be used in education as well. Common language can be used to support learning. Takeaways are clear and identifiable, and it can be relevant. So if you're talking about working with supervisees, with students, using a metaphor around education, and even throwing paper balls into a waste paper bin should be connectable and relevant and meaningful for the students with whom you are working.
Okay, hi everyone, thank you. And so I have found myself using metaphors in my work with clients as well. One that I use a lot is this one about looking in the rearview mirror. And it offers, this metaphor offers some perspective on living life in the past, and it likens it to driving while looking solely, focusing only on the rearview mirror. And so obviously you can see that even the best driver is going to crash if you're not looking at what's coming at you on the road. So in session with a client, I might fine tune that depending on who I'm working with and what is happening with them. Clients who have a difficult time, I guess, forgiving themselves, past mistakes, and they sort of live in that. Using a metaphor where I'll say, have you ever walked backwards, or can you ever imagine just walking backwards, right? And so I then give them a chance to really think about it, tell me what it might look like for them. And I'll hear things like, well, that would be crazy. Like, I wouldn't see like what's coming. I'm going to crash into everyone. I'm getting into everyone's way. I might trip. So I really kind of let them kind of get into it. Really the goal is to enable them to separate just enough from the emotion of the experience, maybe just externalize it so that they can see it from a different perspective. And so before I even have a chance to tie it into what we're talking about in session, I get it. I'm looking backwards, right? So then we could kind of start to talk about what might it look like to take steps towards maybe starting to turn a little bit so that you can actually see and walk forward and see what's coming and be able to maybe change your direction a little bit, engage more with what's happening today. And really, I would kind of tie it back into that rearview mirror. We weren't meant to walk life living backwards. Looking backwards, you're looking at the past. And so similarly to when you're driving, you're going to be aware of the past. You'll be aware of what's behind you. Maybe you learn from it. But that's a small part of how we live our lives, right? And so that's how I've used the looking in the rearview mirror, and I have found it to be very, very effective in just helping clients start to take that step towards moving forward, looking at life and kind of being more engaged with what's happening around them today versus focusing solely and so intently on what has happened to them in the past in the rearview mirror that they can't change.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Mhm.
All right. So this is the metaphor that I like to use with clients. It was super random when I came up with it one day in session, but I like for when we're processing for things to make sense. And I use this a lot when we're talking about modifying and changing behaviors, and especially with thinking patterns. Because I know most times when there's a lot of negative thinking, a lot of self-doubt, some self-esteem issues, you know, a lot of clients just talk about, well, this is how I think, this is just how I am, this is how it's been. But they still have this goal to suddenly think differently about themselves or to learn to practice affirmations and to kind of shift their thought process when living life. And so I use this metaphor to kind of make it make sense in terms of it being possible to unlearn something and to learn something new. So when we think about eating spaghetti, everyone, what is the first utensil that comes to mind?
You can put it in the chat, or thank you.
Right, a fork, right? But so if we think about it, a fork wasn't always the most automatic response to eating spaghetti. As you see in this picture, these children are having a blast using their hands. I have a 17-month-old son. He's just now getting into it, and he goes from eating with his hands to now using a fork. Are we successful just yet? No. We're getting spaghetti all on the walls, on the floor, but it's okay. And we'll get into that part too. But let's just say suddenly, everyone, there was this national law that from here on out, you must now eat spaghetti with a cup. If you choose to eat spaghetti with a fork, it is punishable by death, right? And so hearing that, it sounds ridiculous, it sounds absurd, it sounds super, super extreme, right? And so now we have to kind of put ourselves in a position to learn, one, how to eat spaghetti with a cup and make this our new norm. And so I use this metaphor because essentially, we also talk about progression not being linear too, right? And so as we're learning to use this cup, we may have times where that fork comes to mind, but now we're a little bit more intentional because we know that if we use a fork, it's punishable by death. Though it seems extreme, but can't negative thinking sometimes be a threat to our life? And so I like to use that metaphor, even in terms of bringing in, I don't always use my son, but I'll use it for the sake of the conference. You know, right now he doesn't really have the coordination together. He's just more interested in fork spaghetti mess, right? But over time, his skills are going to improve. That's at least our goal. And so I use that too in terms of thinking patterns. So the negative thinking patterns has been the norm for a very, very long time. It's that fork, right? It's kind of what you've been used to, but now you're a little bit more intentional because your life depends on it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I had to learn where the unmute was. Hello, everyone. So I started off using this before, and I was working with teenagers, those teens 12 to 17, and it was in a substance abuse agency, and there was a lot of resistance to treatment, a lot of resistance to talking to counselors. And so like Sierra, it just came up one day and I just used it. And I asked the young person that I was talking to at the time, I said, well, you know, what would you do if you had this pair of shoes and it was just like your best pair of shoes? It was a pair of Jordans and it was the pair that you've always wanted. And you just, worked really hard and this is what you wanted. And you bought them, got them home, and they were too small. And, they were just like, oh no, then, I would just, some of the kids got kind of smart and they were just like, I would just sell them. Others said, I would just take them back. Because when they would say I would just sell them, I was like, yeah, but you really, really wanted this pair of shoes. And they in turn said, well, I would just take them back to the store and I would just get a new pair. And I said, okay. I said, so I want you to think about counselors that way. Sometimes there are people that you work with and they just don't fit. There's a counselor that may not fit. It doesn't mean that all counselors are bad. It doesn't mean that all counselors are horrible. It just means that the counselor that you just happen to be with at that time doesn't fit. And it's okay for you to ask for a new counselor. It's okay for you to advocate for yourself and speak up and say, hey, we're not working together, or this isn't fitting, or this isn't working for me. And so because of that, then, I feel like I need a new counselor. And learning that even in life, there are people that you have that you just don't fit. And learning that and knowing that and being able to advocate for yourself and speak up for yourself with that. And then a lot of the kids are like, oh, that makes sense. So I started using that with adults as well, and just using it as a pair of shoes or using it as, everybody loves Jordans. I don't, but everybody loves Jordans. And so using that as an example for them to help them to understand the importance of knowing that if they're in a situation and it just doesn't fit, that it's okay to change it and it's okay to ask for that change.
Thank you so much, Chandra. So what I'd like to, before we move forward anymore, is to ask you in the audience, what questions, what are you thinking so far? How about your use of metaphor? Is there anyone who can share how they've used it or used these tools so far? You can come off. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Hey,
Hello.
no, Joe. This is Joe. Hello. How's everything? I was looking at your presentation and how were you giving those metaphors, especially with the. I apologize for ever. So that's. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The metaphor as well. That you were talking about with the marriage and the different way you broke it down. I've used metaphors, but not in a way that's creative like that.
Okay.
And so I'm learning how to do that, listening to what you're saying. So I use a metaphor to just shorten something, like average child experience, the ACE test,
ACEs,
those
okay.
things like that. But yes, I've kind of used it, but not in the way that you're talking about, and listen to more of what you're saying.
Okay. Excellent. You want to give us an example?
Like, I'm sorry. So if I was to look at what you're talking about, when I come to doing any kind of sessions, I can start to look at it and see after one, looking at the client or patient, some of the background on them, and use words or terminology that's more familiar, so that I am creating that connection instead of just looking at this, reading off the fact sheet and just going from hey, this is, and there's no connection. So I think that those metaphors, as I'm listening to you, forms a very good connection and almost gives you a what to expect, the experience what experience you're going to take. So yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I was a little bit too long, but
No, you're perfectly fine. Thank you.
yes, ma'am. Thank
Anyone?
you.
Yeah. There were some other hands up.
I like the struggle of the butterfly. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that, but I use that with students and clients alike. So, it's just something that people can understand, what a caterpillar is and how it evolves into a butterfly. We learn that at such a young age. And so, teaching them the importance of the struggle and that, that's the reason why the caterpillar turns into this beautiful butterfly. Without the struggle and without the challenge and pain sometimes, unfortunately, we can't evolve the way that we were destined to evolve.
Love it. Thank you. Anyone else have any examples of how they've used metaphor? Is this, okay. So this is one thing that I'd like to bring up. My use of metaphor reminds me a lot of people making an attribution of a quote to Sigmund Freud that I'm not sure he actually said. And that is, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but sometimes it's not. So we can use language to soften the discussion of topics that are really, really challenging and difficult for people. So I'm sorry, something just came across my screen that distracted me. So I'm trying to think of an example. For instance, I am working with a client right now who is in a really difficult legal situation. That's vague enough. This person's in a very difficult legal situation, and the person with whom she is involved in this situation has started to create has started to do some things that can create bigger trouble, bigger problems. So when she and I talked about the two of them and should she continue to associate with this person, we talked about them being at the top of a hill and how if you have just like a snowball at the top of a hill and it's rolling down the hill, it's got some size, but as it continues to go down, it's picking up more and more momentum. It's getting bigger and bigger and harder and harder and harder to control. And what she is right now is in a position where she can either stop that snowball from rolling and just keep it where it is and find some way to reduce its magnitude and its volume, or she can continue to create the avalanche that's going to happen if she doesn't stop the snowball while she has the chance. And that actually made more sense. She said she could actually see things flying in her mind because she was able to take the situation, distance it from herself a little bit, and create more of an animated, I guess, visualization of the situation she's in, but could see that ultimately there'll be destruction at the bottom of that path. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the reason that I brought that up is because with metaphor, we can take things that are very difficult to talk about, legal issues, issues of sexuality, issues around just being confused and not understanding, and create smaller, more palatable, more digestible, bite-sized lessons to help people better navigate and better comprehend the situations in which they find themselves. I smile a little bit in explaining that because I essentially just made metaphors out of what we were talking about to explain why we use metaphors. And one of the other things I've noticed is that throughout the course of my entire life, I've had a very difficult time just delivering information in clear, concise ways. I need to make it more metaphorical for me to even understand it as I present it to my classes, to my supervisees, and to my clients. So with that, that's the information that I have to present. Any of my co-presenters have anything you'd like to share before we take any questions?
I just want to say that I like the metaphor of the house. And I also use the one that's the energy bus as well, and helping people to understand that they are the driver of their bus. And there's a book called The Energy Bus that I talk with supervisees when I've done all of our virtual classes or our virtual trainings or that we use. And I use that one a lot in helping people to understand that they are the ones who control who gets on their bus and who gets off their bus because they're the driver of the bus. And so the positive energy that they use to put on their bus and those people that they think about that are supportive of them, that they can use to help them move their bus along because the positive energy is what moves it along. But even when I work with severely mentally ill patients, that has helped them a lot to be able to do that, as well as the house. I love using the house in groups, in a group setting.
I had another one too, that I kind of use with clients in terms of them understanding their triggers and reducing blaming behavior. So if there's like one, let's just say if, they really had a strong dislike for people that wore yellow shirts, right? And so they see someone in the store and this person has on a yellow shirt and they just immediately become super infuriated, right? Is it really that person that's infuriating you, or is that an internal issue that we haven't really discussed just yet? And so we kind of just use that to kind of just a lot of examples. And even when you talked about vehicles, right? We talk about that even in terms of self-care. A lot of times clients just like, oh, I can't focus suddenly and I have no motivation and I'm just super tired and my sleep schedule is off. We use a car, if we get in a car and just drive it nonstop, no oil change, no gas, no kind of maintenance whatsoever, and it stops. Are we really surprised, or we have to take a step back to see how has this been functioning and why is it not functioning at its best anymore? And so we talk about that in terms of kind of reflecting back oneself in terms of self-care and kind of just noticing those warning signs and triggers. So if the car just starts shaking a little bit, do we just keep going until it just stops, or do we just realize this is a warning sign, we need to stop and do some maintenance here? And so.
It's a great one. Thank you. Another thing that I also share with clients sometimes is when they are disappointed, well, what we call it in sessions, when someone's disappointed with the way something turned out, we call it beet cake. And beet cake is, you know, you see this beautiful cake someone presents to you. It's got this beautiful, rich color. It's actually purple. That's unusual. It's going to be beautiful. It's frosted well. It's so awesome. I cut into it. It looks good. Then I taste it, and it's made out of beets. And if I made a hierarchy of everything in the world that I will eat, the last thing on that list would be purple beets. I think they're beautiful. I hate them with the heat of 1,000 hells. They're just horrible to me. So for me, the idea of a beautiful, pretty cake, it's right there, it's frosted, and you're going to slice into it. It looks good, and then you taste it, and it tastes like beets, is so incredibly disappointing and disarming because it's not at all what you expected. And I've gotten a couple of people to even laugh about, yes, I had this idea that I was going to go into this particular situation. In my mind, I had it all inflated on how wonderful it was going to be. I got there, and I got something totally different than what I expected. And I was really disappointed. So to find a way to bring some levity to that and to lighten it up a little bit allows people sometimes the entry point to explaining and discussing things that otherwise were really very difficult. My beet cake metaphor often comes up with breakups. So somebody had this relationship, everything was amazing, it was wonderful, and then you really got into it, and it was like, oh, this is what this is made of, and this is what I'm supposed to deal with. This is not for me. Let me find my way out of it. And we find some ways to discuss something that was painful, but ultimately you can see that, you know, even though it's painful, this was nasty for me, and I don't want this to be a part of my life. So we use metaphors and ways to really sometimes crack the door open to talk about really difficult situations that we face with a little more humor and a little bit of distance from them. Okay. Anything else from my amazing gallery of co-presenters? And if not, we can take a couple of questions because we have about 10 minutes. Anyone have any questions for us? Sophie. I like this. You cannot appreciate the stars without the darkness that surround it. That's a nice one. No questions? Can you share your video with us? The video of the paper balls, is that what you're asking for? Yep, sure can. If you put your email in the chat, I am more than happy to send it. And these videos will also be, thank you, on the department's YouTube page. Any other questions, concerns? All right, if there are no questions in the chat or that anyone wants to share, I'm interested in differences of using metaphors between groups and individual counseling. Can you tell me more what you mean, William? And you're welcome, Kristen. William said, I'm interested in hear differences of using metaphors between groups and individual counseling. How we would use them in group versus in individual counseling? Is that what you're asking? do they need to be expanded? I have an answer for that, but I'd like to make sure my co-presenters have an option to answer it too. Anybody have an answer for that? Would they need to be
I will.
expanded? Sure.
So it just really depends. So I've used like the metaphor with the sneakers. I've done that a lot in individual counseling, but I've also used it in a group setting as well. I actually love doing groups, and so any of the things that I do, I will use it. And sometimes when you're using it, you have to think about the audience that you're with and think about who you're presenting to. And so because of that, then what you would do is that sometimes you do have to kind of like, change it a little bit based on the person that you're talking to at the time. And, it could be where you tone it down. But I think that any of the metaphors that we presented today or metaphors that you come up with, they could be used in either setting. And it's just a matter of just changing it around a little bit to address a group or address an individual based on the person that you're working with.
I definitely agree with Chandra. I used to do a lot of groups when I worked at an inpatient psychiatric facility for children and adolescents. And sometimes the groups were split intentionally based on functioning levels, but sometimes we would have some kids in the groups that some were higher functioning and some were much lower. And so these metaphors would turn more so into activities. And so when we talk about positive, for example, positive and negative behaviors, I did an intervention where we talked about superheroes and villains, right? Kind of had them identify certain things. And then at the end, we had this big superhero workout because they were super active kids and it just worked out for all of us. But that, just depending on, like Chandra said, the group that you have and their functioning level, right? So as we're all talking today, this was all one big group, then it sounds like we're all just understanding what the metaphors were discussed today versus, a mixed group per se.
Sierra, that reminded me a little bit of, I think I mentioned earlier, my brother's a hospital chaplain in Florida and had someone who had a pretty significant reason for being hospitalized, pretty significant illness. And one of the ways in which they worked to support this person was to get a group this person had been involved in the hospital. And they all came in and it did kind of they recorded it, a little dance video, and each person was in a different superhero costume. And there was it was silliness, but it was also helpful because there was levity. It helped to bring this person's mood up. It helped to bring a superhero theme into the healing space, and also identified that this person had done something miraculous, something heroic by fighting the circumstance and the situation in which they found themselves. We can use it in really creative ways. My client with Are You There, God Is Me, Margaret, one of the other things that we have done is she talked about just not really having any movement in her life, just feeling really stuck. So what we did was I asked this person her favorite song, and she brought her favorite song in on her phone, and we created a line dance. So we were not stuck. We had movement in the session. So I'm in my session with this 60-something-year-old lady who just learned what a menstrual period is, making up line dances, but that's what she needed to do. And it got her to not feel like she was stuck. And it's interesting, that happened maybe 3 years ago. And she still talks about how great it felt to actually get up and move in the session. So we can use metaphors by what we say. We can symbolically act out that stuckness or alleviating stuckness by physically using metaphor in our sessions. There are things that we can do to be creative, take away the sting and the stiffness from a situation, and have our clients and our supervisors and our students really feel like they're doing something to get past the situations in which they find themselves. All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns, words of wisdom, emotional snacks, anything anyone needs to share? If not, I thank you very much for your time on behalf of myself and all of my co-presenters. And I also sent out that BuzzFeed video.